30 million Californians get their drinking water through a system of dirt walls that were stacked up by hand more than 100 years ago. 1,100 miles of them. They ring roughly 60 islands of farmland in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, and most of those islands have sunk so far that they now sit between 10 and 25 feet below sea level. The walls are not holding back a river flood. They are holding back the weight of San Francisco Bay, every hour of every day, with no break and no day off. The odds of a magnitude 6.7 or larger earthquake hitting the San Francisco Bay Area before 2043 sit at 72%. The Delta lies right at the edge of that fault network. Many of its levees are in no shape to live through hard shaking. But here is the detail that tells the real story. The danger is not the flood. A Delta island can flood, and it can be pumped dry again. That has happened dozens of times. The danger is what rushes in behind the flood. When a levee fails, the water that pours into that sunken island gets pulled in from the west, from San Francisco Bay, and that water is salt. Fail enough levees at once, and the salt does not stop at the island. It keeps moving east, into the exact stretch of channel where California pumps its drinking water. One earthquake could turn the water supply for 2/3 of a state salty, and keep it salty for years. To understand how 30 million people ended up depending on a wall of dirt, you have to go back to the Marsh. Before California was a state, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta was the largest freshwater tidal marsh on the west coast of the Americas. Roughly 700,000 acres of reeds, side streams, and standing water, where the two biggest rivers in the state came together before reaching the sea. It was not land, it was not water. It was something in between, flooding and draining twice a day with the tide. Then came the draining. A federal land law in 1850 handed the marsh to anyone willing to drain it. Starting in the 1850s and running through the end of the century, crews, many of them Chinese workers using shovels and wheelbarrows, threw up dirt levees by hand to wall off parts of the marsh and pump them dry. The drained parts became islands of farmland. The peat soil underneath was some of the richest dirt in North America, black and deep, built up over thousands of years of rotted marsh plants. Farmers thought a levee 4 feet high would be enough to hold the tides back. It was not even close. That is where the slow disaster started. Peat is mostly carbon. When you drain it, open it to air, and plow it, it breaks down. It does not wash away. It burns off into the air, a sliver of an inch at a time, year after year. For more than 150 years, the islands of the Delta have been sinking from the inside. Not from any flood, from farming itself. Some islands have dropped a full 2 stories below the rivers around them. The ground keeps disappearing into the sky, and the levees have to be raised again and again just to keep up with land that will not stop falling. The result is the strangest landscape in California. Stand on one of these islands today, and the river is not below you. The river is above you, on the other side of a dirt wall, sometimes 20 feet over your head. The island is a bowl. The levee is the rim of the bowl, and the rim is the only thing in the way. Now zoom out and look at where this sits. The Delta is an inland triangle, roughly 1,100 square miles, with the city of Sacramento at the north point, Stockton at the east, and Suisun Bay and San Francisco Bay opening to the west. The Sacramento River comes down from the north, carrying snowmelt off the Sierra Nevada. The San Joaquin River comes up from the south. They braid together through hundreds of miles of channels and side streams. And somewhere in the middle of that braid, the water is fresh enough to drink. It is fresh because the rivers push the salt back. Fresh water flowing down from the mountains keeps the ocean from creeping in through the bay. That balance is the whole game. As long as enough river water is moving through the Delta toward the sea, the salt line stays west, out near Suisun Bay, and the drinking water stays clean. Move that line a few miles east, and you have a problem. Move it past the pumps, and you have a disaster. Down in the south, Delta sits the machinery that makes modern California possible. 2 huge pumping plants. The Banks Pumping Plant feeds the State Water Project. The Jones Pumping Plant feeds the Federal Central Valley Project. Together, they lift Delta water up and out into canals that carry it hundreds of miles south to farms and cities. Here is the part that should not be possible. The State Water Project, the system that waters a huge share of the state, has exactly one place where it draws that water. It is right here, in the South Delta. There is no second intake. There is no backup straw. One spot, feeding tens of millions of people. So the whole system rests on one quiet bet. that the rivers keep pushing the salt west, and that the dirt walls keep the islands dry, so the channels stay exactly where the engineers drew them on the map. Here is what an earthquake does to that bet. A normal flood control levee gets a rest. The river rises, the levee takes the pressure for a few days, then the river drops and the pressure comes off. The dirt dries out. It gets a day off. A delta levee never gets that day. The water on the other side never leaves. The levee is loaded 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, the same way the wall of an above-ground swimming pool is loaded. It is not a flood barrier that works during a storm. It is the side of a tank that is always full, holding back water that is always trying to get in. Now shake that tank. Delta levees sit on peat and soft river mud, which is close to the worst possible base for an earthquake. When soaked soil like that gets shaken hard, it can turn to liquid. For a few terrible seconds, it stops acting like solid ground and starts acting like a heavy liquid. A levee, built on soil that turns to liquid, does not crack like concrete. It slumps. It spreads sideways and sinks into the mud underneath it, and the water that was leaning on it pours straight through the gap before anyone can move a sandbag. The engineers who have spent years driving test rigs into delta levees and shaking them have landed on one blunt point. All it takes is one bad spot in a single levee to flood an entire island. One bad spot, and the Bay Area does not have one fault. It has a whole network of them, including the Hayward Fault, one of the most dangerous in the country. The fear that water engineers have spelled out for 2 full decades is not a single break. It is many islands, spread across the delta, going down in the same 60 seconds of shaking. The most respected levee experts in the state have been asked to describe that picture in plain terms, and the word they keep reaching for is Armageddon. When many islands flood at once, the delta stops being a set of neat channels and becomes a wide open bay. All that suddenly empty space below sea level has to fill with water, and it pulls that water in from the closest source, which is the salt water of San Francisco Bay. The flow in the delta flips around. Instead of fresh water pushing salt out toward the ocean, salt comes rushing in toward the land. It reaches the pumps, and once the salt is in, you cannot pump it back out. You have to wait for enough fresh river water to flush it west again, and in a dry year that water simply does not exist. And salty water is not a problem you fix overnight. A normal drinking water plant is built to filter out dirt and kill germs. It is not built to pull salt out of water. That takes a whole different process, far more costly, and the delta system was never designed around it. Salt also does not just sit in the channel. It soaks into the peat of every flooded island it touches, and it kills crops that were never built to drink it. Even after the islands are pumped dry, the ground stays ruined for crops until enough fresh water rinses it clean. The state's own modeling has put a number on it. A medium-sized earthquake in the delta could cut off the freshwater delivery system for somewhere between 20 and 30 months, with money losses around $40 billion. That is not a flood you bail out of in a week. That is 2 years or more of a state of 40 million people unable to count on the water in its single most important pipe. If you are finding this useful, subscribe. We cover water crises, earthquakes, and infrastructure failures like this every week, with the full picture you need to actually follow what is going on. So pull back from the delta and look at the chain of damage, the way it would really move outward. First, the islands and the people on them. Roughly 500,000 people live in and around the delta, in towns like Stockton, Isleton, and Bethel Island, behind those same dirt walls. When a delta island floods, it does not flood the way a river spills over its banks, with water rising slowly up the streets. It floods like a bathtub, because the island floor is far below the water outside. There is no high ground inside the bowl. The water finds the bottom and stays there until it is pumped out. And pumping out a single 12,000-acre island can take 5 months of running diesel pumps, day and night. Second, the farmland inside the delta itself. The delta islands grow corn, alfalfa, tomatoes, wine grapes, asparagus, and pasture, all on that deep peat soil. A flooded island is not farmland again for a long time afterward. Salt water that fills the bowl soaks down into the ground, and even after the island is pumped dry, the soil can take years to rinse clean enough to plant. Crops do not simply pick up where they left off. Whole growing seasons vanish, and the farm families behind those private levees take the loss themselves. Third, the pumping plants. This is where the whole story turns. The Banks and Jones plants in the South Delta can only move water that is fresh enough to use. The moment salt reaches them, operators have no choice. They shut the pumps down, and the second those pumps go quiet, the canals running south go dry from the top. Not reduced, not rationed, off. There is no backup system standing by to quietly take over. The water just stops moving. Fourth, the cities downstream. The water from those pumps does not stay local. It flows to the Bay Area, to Silicon Valley, to the Central Coast, and over the Tehachapi Mountains into Southern California. The huge regional supplier that serves around 19 million people from Los Angeles to San Diego leans heavily on state water project deliveries that begin at that one delta intake. A salt event in the delta does not feel like an earthquake to those 19 million people. It feels like a years-long shortage in their own faucet, 300 miles from the broken levee they never knew existed. Fifth, the farms of the San Joaquin Valley and the food they grow. The Delta watershed supplies water to more than 6 million acres of farmland. The San Joaquin Valley is one of the most productive farming regions on the planet, growing a huge share of the country's almonds, pistachios, canning tomatoes, and dairy. A large part of it runs on water that is pumped out of the Delta and carried south through those same canals. Cut that supply for 2 years, and the loss is not just felt in one state's grocery aisles. It moves through the national food supply as higher prices, broken deals, and orchards that get bulldozed because a fruit tree cannot wait 2 years for water. One earthquake, one bad spot in one levee, copied across an aging network of dirt. And the line of damage runs from a sunken cornfield in the Delta all the way to a grocery shelf on the other side of the country. This is not a guess that has never been tested. The Delta has been failing in slow motion for decades, and the warnings keep arriving right on schedule. It has happened before without an earthquake at all. In 1972, a levee failure pulled salt water into the Delta and pushed the contamination problem onto the front page for the first time. Since 1980, 27 Delta islands have been partly or fully flooded. The clearest single example came on June 3, 2004. The West Levee of Upper Jones Tract failed at about 7:50 in the morning. There was no storm, there was no earthquake, there was no flood crest on the river. The cause was studied and never explained. Water from Middle River poured through the gap and flooded 12,000 acres with roughly 160,000 acre-feet of water. It took 3 weeks just to close the break and 5 months to pump the island dry again. The repair ran about $90 million, and total losses climbed past $200 million. That was the calm day version. No shaking at all. Just a quiet summer morning and a wall of dirt that decided to stop holding. The wet years are no safer than the calm ones. During the heavy winter storms of early 2023, the Sacramento River swelled toward flood stage, and levees up and down the system sprang leaks. At one site, the repair cost almost $700,000, and the local farmers had to take out a loan to pay for it themselves. Then, in 2024, water began seeping underneath the levee that rings Victoria Island, west of Stockton, only a few miles north of the pumping plants that supply 30 million people. A full break there would have done exactly what the earthquake picture describes. It would have created a powerful pull, dragging salty bay water straight toward the intakes. Crews drove steel sheets deep into the levee to choke off the flow before the leak became a break. They stopped that one in time. The next one is a coin flip, and the money to keep stopping them is not reliably there. It would take around $3 billion to fix and properly keep up the full 1,100-mile network. Most of those levees are privately owned, kept up by small local water districts and the farmers who live behind them, not by the state and not by the federal government. The people who fix these levees for a living have a name for why the funding keeps drying up. They call it the flood memory half-life. A politician's memory of a disaster lasts maybe 6 to 9 months. If a flood does not happen every single year, the worry fades, and the budget fades right along with it. There is a comparison that water engineers have made for 20 years, and it is not a comfortable one. After Hurricane Katrina flooded New Orleans in 2005, the people who studied both systems pointed out that the Delta levees were at least as weak as the levees that failed in Louisiana. New Orleans had its disaster. The Delta has only had warnings. The difference between a warning and a disaster, in this case, is one fault and one bad morning. California does have a plan, and it has been arguing about that plan for more than 50 years. The current version is a proposed 45-mile tunnel that would carry Sacramento River water deep underneath the Delta, from new intakes in the north straight down to the canals in the south, going around the weak channels and the salt-prone pumps. The official price tag is just over $20 billion, and the tunnel would sit 100 to 130 feet underground, built to live through an earthquake. Outside money experts who have checked the math put the real cost between $60 and $100 billion. The governor has pushed hard to speed it up. A group of Delta area lawmakers, Delta residents, tribes, and nature groups has fought it just as hard. For the people who live in the Delta, the tunnel is not just an idea on paper. It is a construction site planned on land that families have farmed and grazed for 3 generations. And the feeling on the ground is that nobody making the decisions cares much about the people standing on top of the problem. And even on the most hopeful timeline anyone has offered, building would not begin until 2029 and would take roughly 13 years to finish. 13 years is a long time to outrun a 72% chance. So the questions sit there, unanswered, over a landscape that will not stop sinking. What happens to 19 million people in Southern California if the one Delta intake runs salt for 2 years? How do you keep 500,000 Delta residents safe behind privately owned dirt walls that cannot live through hard shaking? Why does the money to fix those walls vanish every time a year goes by without a flood? And if the long-term fix is a tunnel that will not carry a drop of water until the 2040s, what exactly is protecting the water supply between now and then? Nobody can answer those yet. The data does not say when the fault moves. It only says how likely it is, and how bad it gets when it finally does. The Delta has not had its earthquake. The rivers are still pushing the salt line west, out towards Suisun Bay where it belongs. The pumps south of Stockton are still pulling fresh water up into the canals, the way they have every day for decades, feeding farms and cities that have no idea their water starts here. But the islands are still sinking, an inch at a time, deeper below the rivers every year. The dirt walls are still wet on the bay side, still loaded, still holding without a single day of rest. And underneath all of it, the fault has not moved yet.